Hello friends, and welcome to the Planeswalker Project's Guide to Commander 2019. In this series, we're going to be covering all 4 of the Commander 2019 Precon decks, my takes on the new commanders, the reprints, the new cards, and a few quick swap outs to help make the deck work a little better. If you enjoy this series and would like to see it next year, remember to hit that like button. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Faceless Menace Precon, a deck in black, green, and blue that focuses on the Morph mechanic. Let's begin by looking at our 3 options for commanders in this deck. Kadena, Slinking Sorcerer, is a 3/3 Naga wizard for 4 mana that reads, the first face-down creature spell you cast each turn costs 3 mana less to cast. Whenever a face-down creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Kadena is the face card for the Morph deck and is one of the deck that prioritizes the mechanic more than the other 2 commanders. Kadena's ability makes your first Morph card played each turn free, and every Morph card you play face-down lets you draw a card. This is a powerful engine and addresses an issue that a lot of decks face. Once you start playing your spells in droves each turn, you might run out of cards in your hand to keep on playing. With Kadena, you can keep drawing into hopefully more gas, and I personally prefer her as the commander right out of the box, but let's look at the other 2. Next up is Volrath the Shapestealer, a 7/5 for 5 mana that reads, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature. For 1 mana, until your next turn, Volrath becomes a copy of target creature with a counter on it, except it's 7/5 and has this ability. Volrath intrigues me greatly, not so much for this deck, but this greatly reminds me of another deck of mine, Hapatra Vizier of Poisons. Hapatra deals in -1/-1 counters, and Volrath is in the same colors, but with the addition of blue, this could be a nice evolution for the deck to take. It also has some elements of another popular commander, Lazov Dimir Mastermind. You can put a counter on a creature that seems fun, and then for a really cheap price of 1 mana, Volrath can become that creature, except it retains Volrath's early stats and the ability to change ability. This can be a useful creature and as a combat trick. I really wouldn't run this as the commander of this deck right out of the box, as not a lot of the deck really synergizes with him, but I would definitely recommend building a deck exclusively to take advantage of that ability. Lastly, Rayami, First of the Fallen, is a 5/4 vampire for 4 mana that reads, if a non-token creature would die, exile that card with a blood counter on it instead. As long as an exiled creature card with the blood counter has flying, Rayami has flying, yada yada, same goes for a bunch of other abilities. Rayami is perhaps my least favorite of the 3 main legends. While I think it is a good card, I feel it's more dependent on what the other creatures in play have as abilities, and given this deck really focuses on Morph, maybe a few other abilities here or there, I would much rather build this deck to feature a wide array of abilities to make Rayami a bit more of a Voltron commander, but, using the corpses of creatures as the power-ups. Those other cards can have utility abilities that make them doubly useful for more than just their keyword abilities. In this deck, we also got a number of pretty good reprints as well as some spicy new cards. I do want to talk about a few of them, and if there are some that you're excited about, let me know in the comment section. Seedborn Muse is a powerful staple in green decks, letting you untap everything on each other player's untap step. With the way this deck works, we're going to want our mana open on our off turns to respond to our opponent's plays. I really like this card here to put out our morphs on our turns, and since flipping a card doesn't use the stack, we can flip our spells over at a moment's notice in response if we happen to have the mana open, which with the way that Muse works is very capable. I think this is the best reprint in this deck, but we do have some others to mention. Sakura Tribe Elder is a classic ramp card for commander decks, letting you sack this snake to snag a basic land and to play tapped. It's very good utility, and I love this kind of innocuous ability on my early game. Players might be less tempted to attack at the opponent who has yet to play anything big and scary, making this quite the good include. I also like the new artwork. Vraska the Unseen is a Planeswalker that's actually one of my favorites, and for good reason. She has 2 options for removal, one being targeted towards a non-land permanent, and it lets you opt for the one that you want to pop, while her plus ability makes her more of a threat to any creature wanting to attack at her. And given that her ultimate creates 3 assassins capable of taking out each of our opponents with a single touch, those opponents are going to be wanting to take down Vraska as soon as she enters the battlefield. So yeah, good card. The last two notable reprints are Reliquary Tower and Ash Barrens. Reliquary Tower is key for a deck like this, as with the card draw engines I want to put into this, might make for some sizable hands, and I want to hold on to the cards I draw into. Ash Barrens is a great land cycle card, letting you snag whichever basic land you may need at any moment. One of the things I really like about this deck is because Morph uses a generic cost of 3 rather than any colored mana requirement, your demand for mana fixing and color fixing is a lot more lax in this deck. And again, the War Barons is a nice fix for that situation. Now on to the new cards. I found a few cards from this Precon that are brand new that are actually really cool. Not all of them are relevant to the deck strategy, but I like the value they bring about. Firstly is Thought Sponge. This 1/1 for 4 mana has Flash, and when it enters the battlefield it gets a number of +1 counters on it equal to the greatest amount of cards drawn by an opponent this turn. And should SpongeBob die, you draw cards equal to its power. So this is a number of utilities, one main one being a threat against opponents who want to go all crazy with their card draw engines and such. That's nice you've drawn 20 cards, hope you've got some nice removal against my giant spongy boy. And if it isn't an exile removal spell, I get to draw a bunch of cards. Hey Morph players, anyone want fancy Sponge Tribal deck? Scroll of Fate is a 3 mana artifact that lets you tap to manifest a card in your hand. Manifest is sorta like Morph, but you can only turn it face up if it's a creature card, and this is also usable on cards that don't have Morph, which can be very useful. I love this card for its cost and its efficiency. For a while I considered this to be better than Primordial Mists, but now I think I would rather run both. Scaretiller is a new Scarecrow, so to you Reaper King players out there, a very merry birthday to you. Whenever this card gets tapped, you can either put a land from your hand into the battlefield tapped, or return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is great recursion, it's great for dredge decks, graveyard decks, Gitrod decks, and a whole bunch of other decks that might want to recycle our lands. I would love this in conjunction with some fetch lands, easily letting you reuse them over and over again. Thieving Amalgam is perhaps the first card I've seen that is mana cost over 5 that I'm actually hyped about. This 7-drop 6/7 lets you manifest the top card of each player's library at the beginning of their respective upkeeps. And whenever a creature you control but don't own, like say those manifested cards, dies, its owner loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This is a great utility alongside cards like, Ghastly Conscription, where you'll find yourself with some Facetown Doys that you borrowed from your opponents. The size of this thing also means it's not going anywhere easily, and quite frankly, the risk of losing life off of all the other creatures dying might deter a board wipe. Just a little confused on the creature type being Ape Snake, got some weird breeding things going on in this neck of the multiverse. Lastly, Mire and Misery is a 2-mana sorcery that makes each opponent sacrifice a creature or enchantment. First off, Mazeret called, thank you for those counters. Secondly, this is enchantment removal in black, something we really don't have much of, if any at all. And for just 2 mana, even though the opponent still has their choice of which enchantment or creature to sacrifice, I still think this is good design space to explore. Okay, so now for the most important part of this deck guide, how to upgrade it. I want to discuss a few cards that I would remove right off the bat and some cards to swap them out for to maybe make this deck run just a little better. I'm not saying any of these cards are bad necessarily, I just feel like they might not contribute enough to the deck that I want to keep them in. With that in mind, I do love me some Great Oak Guardian, it's just not here. I get what we're going for with the +2/+2 and untap our creatures, but honestly it's 6 mana, and that price I really just don't want that ability for that much. Biomass Mutation isn't bad, it's a nice pump spell, but again, I feel like you really need to sink a lot of mana into this card to make it impactful, and so it's chopped. Hex is out as well. I feel like in a deck like this is just running a lot of mana intensive costs like the Morph costs. A 6-drop kill spell is just way too clunky. Yes, it removes 6 target creatures, and honestly I'd rather just pay 1 extra blue mana and just Cyclonic Rift and hit everything. Not that I added the Rift into this deck, I'm just not really big on this spell. Urban Evolution is a ramp spell of sorts. It draws you 3, gives you an extra land drop for that turn. It's not a bad ability, but I want my ramp to be in the 2 to 3 or maybe 4 drop slots. 5 mana, generic colors, and blue-green, a little too much. Sagu Mauler is next, and this one is a weird take. It's a big, tramply, hexproofy boy, but it's mostly just a hard-to-remove beat stick. The morph cost being 1 mana cheaper might make me tempted to run it so I can attack with it as a 2/2 face down, and when they choose not to block it, turn it into some thick damage for 5 mana, but for now I decided to just cut it from the team. Apex Altasaur is perhaps one of my favorite cards from the deck, and it's a very big Timmy card. It's a 10/10 that whenever it's dealt damage, it fights and likely kills a target creature we don't control. It's tremendous, but again, it's a 9-drop that mostly is just a beater and isn't really doing it for me. I think the goal I had in mind with this deck was to go combo heavy with my card draw engines, playing morphs every turn, and just leaving a field full of trap cards, waiting for my opponent to make a wrong move. Something big and obvious like this, maybe not the most subtle of a move. I think that's what it is. I want this deck to be stealthy, and the Altasaur isn't exactly stealthy. Now, the last card I want to remove from the deck is Tezzeret's Gambit. This card draws a card and proliferates. Nothing the deck really wants or needs per se. As I get it, this is in the deck for the sake of Volrath, but I have other cards for card draw engines that we can discuss in just a moment. So what cards should we put in? Well, I want to capitalize on that card draw engine that's offered by our commander, Kadena, and the best way to do that is with more card draw engines. Both Soul of the Harvest and Primordial Sage are pretty high up on the curve, but they can generate a ton of additional value in tandem with Kadena. Play a Morph, draw 2 or 3 cards, lather, rinse, repeat. Either of those two would do great in the deck, although my personal preference is Soul of the Harvest just because of the more aggressive stats and trample. The other card draw engine is Beast Whisperer. Similar ability, only on a 4-drop, so it comes out a lot sooner, and we begin generating a card draw. See, many of my commander decks over the years have had subpar card draw, and having a commander deck capable of producing such an engine to remedy this has me excited to open up the gates to more and more. Redundancy in this matter is not a bad thing. Dulcet Sirens is another morph creature and one I really like for the deck. See, the mystery of having the things laying in wait, our opponents might want to try to take us out while they can, and so this card can be useful to force certain creatures to attack certain players, playing into both the political game and into protecting us from potential commander damage. Karsieg Deceiver is a card I'm actually surprised didn't see a reprint in the deck. This is a blue mana dork, which is weird, but it's also restricted to only paying for face down cards, morph and manifest creatures, so literally just our deck. It's also a 0/4, making it somewhat useful as a blocker if we absolutely need to, and I just really think this deck would benefit a lot from having this kind of mana dork. I'm sure this card will see a jump in price, but Dream Chisel reduces the cost of face down creatures by 1 mana, which while our commander makes the first face down we cast 3 less to play, essentially making it free, Dream Chisel helps with everything after that. Soul Ring into Dream Chisel means any single morph will only ever need a Soul Ring to tap, which is pretty nice. Primordial Mist, an enchantment from the 2018 Precon decks, lets you manifest the top card of your library at the beginning of your end step. You can also exile a face down permanent face up, and you can play that card this turn. I love this card in this deck, having multiple methods of getting those face down cards going. This also lets you manage any manifested cards that might not be creatures which would otherwise remain forever face down 2/2s. Lastly, Alchemist's Refuge is something I think this deck will do well with. This land lets you have a 1-turn Vedalken Orrery, but it being on a land, it's a lot more safer. Our commander lets the first morph you cast each turn free, so being able to play 2 mana to play something on our opponent's turn can generate us extra value. Yeah, you have to pay 2 specifically colored mana to use it, but I think a net saving of 1 mana that can be used elsewhere is pretty good. So I want to take a quick second to talk about some all-stars in the deck, cards that I'm happy to see. Perhaps my biggest picks are Secret Plans and Trail of Mystery. I actually contemplated buying some of these before preview season, unsure if they would make it into the Precon, but I'm happy to see they're there. Secret Plans gives our face down booties a little buff, and whenever a permanent is turned face up, we draw a card. So with this and our commander, we draw a card when we place the card face down, and then when it turns face up, we draw another card. I love how much synergy and value that can come from this deck. As for Trail of Mystery, whenever a face-down creature enters our battlefield, we get a land from our library to our hand, and if a permanent turns face up and it's a creature, it gets +2/+2 till the end of turn. If we choose to flip during combat, that's going to have an extra little bite to it. Inox Survivalist and Den Protector are both great utility creatures, letting us snipe off problem enchantments and artifacts with the Survivalist, and the Den Protector acts as a sort of Eternal Witness variant that plays right into our deck's theme. Death Mist Raptor is a nice little bit of repeating recursion, letting us return our little lizard friend from the graveyard whenever we flip a permanent face up. Brehm Haruspex is even more card draw, giving us cards whenever our non-token creatures die. Do note that face-down creatures, even if they're using the Morph and Manifest overlay card, they do not count as tokens and will obviously trigger the Haruspex. Ixodron is just a joy for this deck, acting as a reset button for some of our utility morphs, while being a very rude way of dealing with our opponents' board. Oh hey, I see that everyone has a lot of really nice creatures in play. Well, here's our Ixodron to turn them all into face-down goodness. You don't have a way to turn them face up? Sorry about that. Ghastly Conscription, I'm going to be honest with you, I was actually thinking of axing this one in my build at first, but then I remembered that reading the card explains the card, and this can be a really nasty win con. You can target whoever's graveyard is the most full, and they all become manifested on your board. If they're creatures, you can do that manifesty turn them upside up thing, which in my book puts them in a very similar boat to Rise of the Dark Realms. Grismold, while not actually able to be the commander of the Precon right out of the box, is still a pretty groovy take on a token deck, and I do feel I would add this to some of my actual Golgari decks. It's a bit of a different take on a political Golgari deck, and in a similar vein to Slimefoot, I really like this card. Mazurek might like this. I really like the way this deck comes off. Morph is a mechanic that has a special place in my heart, being one of the first mechanics in Magic I learned about. Titanic Bullvox was one of the first cards I ever owned, and while it's probably not good in this deck, even though it has Morph, I'm probably going to run it in there anyway just because I can. Having such a powerful group of card advantage generators really puts this deck up on my list, and it being in one of my favorite color combinations just has me really excited to brew with it. The current value of the cards in this deck is about 200 if we're going to try to build it from absolute scratch, so I think there's some good value in here too. This is the deck with the super awesome Siegborn Muse reprint in it, so if nothing else, the Muse is great commander staple I highly recommend. So that's going to wrap up our look at the Faceless Menace Precon deck. What cards are you most excited to try out in this deck? Are you going to be buying this deck to start building with this year's Commander Precons? I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe with notifications on so you can check out the other decks from this year's Precon as we explore all 4 of the Commander decks. As always, I appreciate your time hanging out with me chatting some Magic the Gathering, and I'll see you next time.